Minnesota presents itself to the country as a land of 10,000 lakes, Scandinavian pragmatism, and a civic culture so functional it borders on self-congratulation, and the presentation has been largely accepted without scrutiny. Beneath the orderly surface sits a state that executed 38 men in the largest mass hanging in American history, watched a mining company dump cancer-causing fibers into the drinking water of an entire region for 2 decades, and lost a major interstate bridge on a clear August evening during rush hour. From the Sandy Lake tragedy that killed hundreds of Ojibwe in a Wisconsin winter to the murder that set American cities on fire in 2020, these are 25 tragedies the North Star State has been carrying beneath its composure. Number 25. The Sandy Lake tragedy killed hundreds through deliberate neglect. In 1850, the federal government issued an order requiring the Ojibwe people of Wisconsin and Minnesota to relocate to Sandy Lake in northern Minnesota, a place with contaminated water, inadequate food supplies, and no infrastructure capable of supporting the thousands of people the government intended to send there. Hundreds of Ojibwe died at Sandy Lake from dysentery and measles during the fall and winter, and hundreds more died on the journey home after the relocation order was eventually rescinded. Chief Buffalo subsequently traveled to Washington to personally petition President Millard Fillmore, an 84-year-old man making an extraordinary journey that successfully reversed federal policy. The Sandy Lake tragedy was not an accident. It was the foreseeable consequence of a removal policy imposed on people whose survival the government conducting the removal had made no serious effort to ensure. Number 24. The Dakota War of 1862 ended a world in Minnesota. By the summer of 1862, the Dakota people of southern Minnesota had been confined to a reservation strip along the Minnesota River, their traditional food sources eliminated, their annuity payments delayed by months while their families starved, and their complaints met by a government agent who suggested they eat grass. In August, the Dakota rose under Chief Little Crow in 6 weeks of warfare that killed an estimated 500 to 800 settlers and an unknown number of Dakota, the deadliest conflict in Minnesota history, before being suppressed by federal troops. The Dakota were expelled from Minnesota by an act of Congress that voided their treaty rights and placed bounties on their scalps. It was the end of a way of life that had sustained the Dakota in the Minnesota River Valley for generations, concluded by a government that had engineered the desperation it then used to justify the expulsion. Number 23. 38 Dakota men were hanged on Christmas Eve. Following the Dakota War, military tribunals convicted 303 Dakota men of murder and rape in trials lasting an average of 10 minutes each, with many defendants given no opportunity to speak on their own behalf. President Lincoln reviewed the convictions and reduced the sentences of 265 men, approving the execution of 38. On December 26, 1862 in Mankato, those 38 men were hanged simultaneously before a crowd of thousands, the largest mass execution in American history, carried out in a public square by a government that had spent the preceding decade dismantling every condition that might have made the war unnecessary. The condemned men sang a Dakota death song together as the platform dropped. The legal process that produced the executions bore no resemblance to what due process requires, a fact that the state of Minnesota has acknowledged and that acknowledgement has not resolved. Number 22. The Great Hinckley Fire killed 400 people in hours. On September 1, 1894, drought conditions, piles left by logging operations, and a dry wind combined to produce a firestorm around the town of Hinckley in Pine County that moved faster than horses could outrun it, consuming the town and surrounding communities in minutes, and killing more than 400 people across an area of several hundred square miles. Engineer Jim Root drove his train through the burning landscape with passengers packed into cars, the wooden coaches catching fire as he accelerated through walls of flame, delivering survivors to the relative safety of a pond where people submerged themselves while the fire passed overhead. The Hinckley Fire was the direct product of industrial logging that had stripped the landscape of mature timber, leaving behind the fuel conditions that made a catastrophic fire not merely possible, but inevitable. And Minnesota's logging industry continued operating on the same model for years after it. Number 21. The Cloquet Moose Lake Fire killed hundreds in a single day. On October 12, 1918, a drought-year fire burning in Carleton County was driven by powerful winds into the communities of Cloquet, Moose Lake, and surrounding towns in a matter of hours, killing approximately 450 people and destroying 38 communities across a swath of northeastern Minnesota. The fire arrived with such speed that many residents had no warning before their neighborhoods were consumed, and the evacuation trains that carried thousands to safety did so through tunnels of flame that scorched the cars and terrified the passengers inside them. The same day's death toll from the 1918 influenza pandemic, which had arrived in Minnesota simultaneously, compounded a medical and emergency response infrastructure already overwhelmed by two catastrophes occurring at the same moment. The Cloquet Fire remains one of the deadliest single-day disasters in Minnesota history, and one of the least remembered outside the communities it destroyed. Number 20. The Milford Mine disaster drowned 41 miners in minutes. On February 5, 1924, workers at the Milford Mine near Brainerd broke through into an underground lake while drilling, sending water flooding through the tunnels at a speed that gave the men inside almost no time to reach surface. 41 of the 48 men working that shift drowned underground in what remains the deadliest mining disaster in Minnesota history. 7 men survived by reaching the surface cage before the water overtook them. The mine had been operating in an area where the presence of underground water was a known geological hazard, and the adequacy of the precautions taken against that hazard was a question the subsequent investigation raised without producing consequences proportionate to 41 deaths. The Milford Mine is now a lake, the water that killed the men inside it filling the space they worked in, and the investigation closed before it could be fully answered. Before we continue, if Minnesota's history of quiet catastrophe is landing harder than you expected, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. It helps us keep uncovering the stories every state has been carrying beneath its surface. Number 19. The Duluth lynchings occurred in front of 10,000 people. On June 15, 1920, a white mob in Duluth broke into the city jail and seized 6 black circus workers who had been accused, on the basis of a claim investigators found no physical evidence to support, of assaulting a white woman. 3 of the men were lynched from a lamppost on 1st Street while an estimated 10,000 people watched, photographed the scene, and in some cases collected pieces of the victims' clothing as souvenirs. 3 men were subsequently tried for murder. 1 received a sentence of 5 to 20 years. No one was convicted of the lynchings themselves. Duluth erected a memorial to the 3 men, Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, and Isaac McGee, in 2003, 83 years after their deaths, in a ceremony that the mayor described as a first step, and that the families of the victims received as something considerably short of the accounting the event required. Number 18. The Armistice Day blizzard killed 49 Minnesota hunters. On November 11, 1940, a storm system that meteorologists had tracked but significantly underestimated arrived over Minnesota as a full blizzard, with temperatures dropping 50 degrees in hours, winds exceeding 60 miles per hour, and snowfall accumulating faster than anyone caught outdoors could manage. Across the Minnesota River Valley and the Mississippi Flyway, duck hunters who had gone out that morning in mild weather were stranded on islands, sandbars, and riverbanks, with no shelter, no adequate clothing, and no means of reaching shore against waves the blizzard had raised to 6 and 8 feet. 49 hunters died across Minnesota, many within sight of shore they could not reach. The Armistice Day blizzard is the event that defined Minnesota weather consciousness for a generation, the specific catastrophe that established, in the most permanent terms available, that November in Minnesota kills people who underestimate it. Number 17. Reserve mining poisoned Lake Superior for 2 decades. From 1956 through 1980, the Reserve Mining Company discharged approximately 67,000 tons of taconite tailings per day into Lake Superior from its Silver Bay processing facility, introducing asbestos-like fibers called Cummingtonite grunerite into the drinking water supply of Duluth and surrounding communities for over 2 decades before a federal court ordered the practice stopped. Reserve Mining and its corporate parent argued throughout the litigation that no proven harm had resulted, a claim complicated by the established carcinogenic properties of asbestos fibers and the presence of those fibers in the drinking water of hundreds of thousands of people. The legal battle, United States versus Reserve Mining Company, became a landmark environmental case that helped define the legal standard for regulating industrial pollution, posing uncertain but serious health risks. Minnesota eventually forced the practice to stop. The Lake Superior shoreline is still processing what those 2 decades deposited in it. Number 16. The 1965 Twin Cities tornado killed 14 people. On May 6, 1965, a tornado outbreak swept the Twin Cities metropolitan area during the evening hours, producing multiple tornadoes that struck residential neighborhoods across the suburbs with little warning and devastating effect. 14 people died, and hundreds were injured across Fridley Spring Lake Park, Mounds View, and surrounding communities in one of the most destructive tornado events in Minnesota history. The outbreak struck a metropolitan area that had been expanding rapidly through the post-war suburban growth that had built thousands of homes directly in the path of the storm system. And it arrived early enough in the development of modern tornado warning systems that the notice available to residents was inadequate for the speed at which the storms moved. The 1965 outbreak remains the deadliest tornado event in Twin Cities history, and the one against which every subsequent metro area tornado warning is measured. Number 15. The Edmund Fitzgerald vanished in a Lake Superior storm. On November 10, 1975, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, a 729-foot freighter carrying 26,000 tons of iron ore pellets from Superior, Wisconsin to Detroit, sank in Lake Superior during a storm with waves estimated at 25 to 35 feet, taking all 29 crew members to the bottom in water 530 feet deep, with no distress call, no life rafts deployed, and no explanation that investigators were ever able to establish with certainty. The Fitzgerald was the largest vessel on the Great Lakes at the time of its sinking. Gordon Lightfoot's 1976 song memorialized the crew and burned the disaster into popular consciousness in a way that the formal investigations never quite managed. The wreck rests on the lake bottom off Whitefish Point, the crew inside it, and the cause of the sinking, whether structural failure, rogue wave, or hatch cover flooding, remains officially undetermined nearly 5 decades after the ship went down. Number 14. The Red River flood of 1997 drowned 2 cities. In April 1997, the Red River of the North crested at Grand Forks, North Dakota, and East Grand Forks, Minnesota, at levels that exceeded the protective dikes built to contain it, flooding nearly all of Grand Forks and substantial portions of East Grand Forks in an event that forced the evacuation of approximately 60,000 people, nearly the entire combined population of both cities, for weeks. A downtown Grand Forks fire that ignited during the flooding and could not be fought because streets were underwater added destruction to inundation in images that defined the disaster for the national audience watching from a distance. East Grand Forks rebuilt using federal buyouts to convert the most flood-vulnerable areas to greenways and parks, creating a buffer that has performed in subsequent flood years as designed. The 1997 flood demonstrated that the Red River's flat gradient and northward flow, draining into a basin that is still frozen when the southern portions thaw, creates flooding dynamics that engineering can manage but cannot fully control. Number 13. Iron Range miners paid for their work with their lungs. The iron ore and taconite mining operations that made the Iron Range of northeastern Minnesota one of the most productive mineral extraction regions in North American history exposed generations of miners to silica dust and later to the asbestos-like fibers in taconite ore, producing elevated rates of mesothelioma, lung cancer, and respiratory disease in the communities of Hibbing, Virginia, Eveleth, and surrounding range towns that researchers documented and the mining industry disputed for decades. The reserve mining litigation established that the fibers were a legitimate health concern in drinking water. The question of what decades of breathing them in processing facilities and open pit mines produced was fought through workers' compensation claims, research disputes, and individual lawsuits that the surviving miners and their families navigated with the resources available to people who had spent their working lives in a physically demanding industry that left them sick. Number 12. The Red Lake school shooting devastated a sovereign nation. On March 21, 2005, 16-year-old Jeff Weiss killed his grandfather and his grandfather's companion at home, then drove to Red Lake High School on the Red Lake Indian Reservation and killed a security guard, a teacher, and 5 students before dying by suicide. 10 people killed in a single day on one of the most isolated reservations in Minnesota. Red Lake is a closed reservation whose sovereignty and geographic isolation meant the community processed the shooting with fewer external resources and less national attention than comparable school shootings in more accessible locations received. The community was already managing generational trauma from historical displacement, poverty rates among the highest in Minnesota, and limited access to mental health services before March 21, 2005. Red Lake held its grief in the particular way that communities hold grief when the rest of the country turns its attention elsewhere before the holding is finished. Number 11. The Boundary Waters blowdown destroyed a wilderness overnight. On July 4, 1999, a straight-line windstorm with sustained winds exceeding 90 miles per hour swept across the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness in northeastern Minnesota, flattening trees across approximately 477,000 acres in a matter of hours, knocking down an estimated 25 million trees and creating a tangle of downed timber so dense that portage routes became impassable, and the most visited wilderness area in the United States was functionally inaccessible for significant portions of the affected area for months. The blowdown created fuel conditions that fire managers immediately identified as catastrophically dangerous, and a series of wildfires in subsequent years, including the 2007 Ham Lake fire, burned through the downed timber in a landscape that the storm had specifically designed to burn. The blowdown was a reminder that the boundary waters, which Minnesota treats as a permanent natural inheritance, exists within weather systems that can fundamentally alter it in an afternoon. Number 10. The I-35 West Bridge collapse shocked the country on a clear day. On August 1, 2007, the Interstate 35 bridge over the Mississippi River in Minneapolis, carrying approximately 140,000 vehicles per day and rated structurally deficient by federal inspectors, collapsed during evening rush hour, dropping 1,000 feet of roadway into the Mississippi River and killing 13 people while injuring 145 others. The collapse occurred on a clear evening with no weather event to blame, in a city that had trusted the inspection and maintenance system to identify a bridge that needed replacement before the replacement became a recovery operation. Investigators identified a design flaw in gusset plates that had been present since the bridge's construction in 1967 and had been insufficient for the load the bridge was carrying, particularly given the additional weight of construction equipment staged on the deck at the time of the collapse. Number 9. The 2011 North Minneapolis tornado struck without enough warning. On May 22, 2011, a tornado touched down in North Minneapolis and moved through densely populated residential neighborhoods, killing one person, injuring dozens, and damaging or destroying approximately 600 homes in a community that was disproportionately low income and had fewer resources to absorb the loss and navigate the recovery process than other parts of the city. The storm struck a neighborhood already managing concentrated poverty, aging housing stock, and limited access to the insurance coverage and savings that make disaster recovery manageable for people who have them. Recovery in North Minneapolis proceeded at the pace that recovery in under-resourced communities reliably proceeds, slower than the damage was inflicted, dependent on external assistance that arrived unevenly, and measured in years while the rest of the city moved on in months. Number 8. The opioid crisis reached Minnesota's rural counties and stayed. Minnesota recorded some of the most rapid increases in opioid overdose deaths in the upper Midwest throughout the 2000s, with pharmaceutical distributors channeling quantities of opioid medications into rural counties, particularly across the Iron Range and the rural agricultural communities of southern Minnesota, that bore no relationship to the medical needs of those populations and every relationship to the distribution quotas that pharmaceutical sales infrastructure was built to meet. Overdose death rates climbed year after year in communities already managing the loss of manufacturing employment and agricultural income volatility, in places where the nearest addiction treatment facility required travel that people without reliable transportation could not arrange. The pharmaceutical companies whose distribution practices drove the crisis-reached settlements with Minnesota, the families in Itasca County and Clearwater County and Coochin County who buried someone in the years those settlements were being negotiated, were not parties to any agreement and received nothing proportionate to what was taken. Number 7. George Floyd's murder set the world on fire for Minneapolis. On May 25, 2020, Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin knelt on the neck of George Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds outside a Cup Foods convenience store in South Minneapolis, while Floyd lost consciousness and died, with 3 other officers present and a bystander's phone camera recording the entire sequence. The video's circulation produced protests in all 50 states and in cities across the world within days, the largest protest movement in American history by some estimates. While Minneapolis's 3rd precinct was burned and the Lake Street corridor sustained damage running into hundreds of millions of dollars across the neighborhoods surrounding the site. Chauvin was convicted of murder in April 2021 in a verdict the city received with relief rather than resolution. Minneapolis has been reckoning with what the 9 minutes and 29 seconds revealed about its police department, its institutional culture, and its relationship with its Black community ever since, without having yet resolved any of it into something that functions as an answer. Number 6. The 2019 Midwest floods inundated Minnesota farms for months. In the spring of 2019, following the wettest 12-month period ever recorded across much of the upper Midwest, Minnesota rivers, the Minnesota, the Red Lake, the Red River of the North, crested at or near historic records and remained above flood stage for weeks, inundating farmland across southern and western Minnesota during planting season in a state whose agricultural economy depends on planting windows that the water made impossible to meet. Flood control infrastructure built in the mid-20th century was calibrated to precipitation patterns that the 21st century's altered climate has exceeded. Farmers who could not plant absorbed losses that federal crop insurance partially addressed, and that the delayed planting window compounded into the following harvest season. The 2019 floods were understood at the time as an extreme event, and understood since as a demonstration of what the agricultural Midwest should expect more of, which is the trajectory of climate-driven flood risk in a region built on the assumption that the worst floods of the 20th century defined the outer boundary of what the rivers could do. Number 5. The 2021 derecho shredded Minnesota's forests and power grid. On May 12, 2021, a derecho, a fast-moving line of severe thunderstorms producing straight-line winds, swept across northern Minnesota with gusts exceeding 100 miles per hour, snapping trees, destroying power lines, and leaving approximately 230,000 Minnesota customers without power in an event that caused an estimated $1 billion in damage across the state. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, still recovering from the 1999 blowdown, absorbed additional tree loss across portions of the wilderness that the previous storm had left standing. Power restoration in remote areas of northern Minnesota took weeks, in communities with limited grid redundancy and sparse enough population that utility investment in hardened infrastructure is difficult to justify on cost-per-customer grounds. The 2021 derecho arrived as another demonstration that Minnesota's timber and electrical infrastructure exists within a wind climate that is less predictable and more violent than the infrastructure was built to assume. Number 4. The 2022 Cass Lake area wildfires displaced thousands of tribal members. In May 2022, the Greenwood Fire and associated fires burning in Cass County and surrounding areas during an early season drought forced the evacuation of thousands of residents across the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe Reservation and surrounding communities, displacing tribal members from land they had lived on through a century of federal policy explicitly designed to remove them from it, in conditions that the reservation's limited emergency management infrastructure was not resourced to manage alone. The fires burned tens of thousands of acres across northern Minnesota during conditions that fire managers described as historically unprecedented for May, in a region where wildfire had historically been a late summer phenomenon, and where the spring fire risk arriving earlier each decade has outpaced the preparation for it. Number 3. The 2024 Hennepin County tornado outbreak struck without mercy. On May 21, 2024, a tornado outbreak swept through the western suburbs of Minneapolis, producing multiple tornadoes that struck Greenfield, Watertown, and surrounding communities in Hennepin, Carver, and Wright counties, with winds the National Weather Service rated at EF2 and EF3 strength. The outbreak killed 2 people, injured dozens, and destroyed or significantly damaged hundreds of structures in communities that had spent the previous decade growing with the suburban confidence of a metropolitan area expanding into what had recently been agricultural land. The May 2024 outbreak was the most destructive tornado event in the Twin Cities metro area since the 1965 outbreak nearly 60 years prior, and arrived as a reminder that Minnesota's position at the northern edge of the American Tornado Corridor does not place it outside the corridor. It places it at the edge of a zone with no fixed boundary that moves north in years, when the atmospheric conditions that produce violent tornadoes find the upper Midwest as hospitable as anywhere else. Number 2. Minnesota's mental health crisis is a disaster without a single image. Minnesota consistently ranks among the top states in the country for overall health outcomes and near the bottom for the accessibility and adequacy of mental health services, a paradox that has produced one of the most severe rural mental health crises in the upper Midwest, measured in suicide rates in greater Minnesota that exceed the national average by margins that emergency management would classify as a crisis if the deaths arrived in a single event rather than distributing themselves across 87 counties over years. The shortage of psychiatric beds, the closure of rural hospitals, and the distances between the people who need mental health services and the facilities providing them have combined in a state that has the resources to address the gap and has consistently chosen to address other things first. The crisis kills Minnesotans at a pace that a tornado would not be permitted to sustain without a declared disaster. And it continues at that pace in the particular silence of a suffering that produces no wreckage visible from the road. Number 1. Minnesota carries its tragedies beneath a composure that has always cost something. The most defining fact about disaster in Minnesota is the composure, the particular cultural determination to manage difficulty without public display that has made the state's losses consistently harder to see than they are. The state that executed 38 men in the largest mass hanging in American history did so in a public square and has spent 160 years calibrating its acknowledgement of it. The state that allowed a mining company to put cancer-causing fibers in its largest lake's drinking water for 2 decades did so in a state that considered itself an environmental steward. The bridge that collapsed on a clear August evening in rush hour had been rated structurally deficient for years in a state that takes its infrastructure seriously. Minnesota has produced catastrophes of the first order, natural, industrial, racial, institutional, and absorbed them with a steadiness that has sometimes been genuine resilience and has sometimes been the composure of a place that has not yet fully looked at what it is being steady about. Now that you know these 25 tragedies and natural disasters that have shaped Minnesota, tell us which one surprised you the most. Drop it in the comments and let's keep uncovering the hidden history of every American state together. Let me know which state I should cover next. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.